Hey everyone, welcome to the start of a new topic. Now in this topic we are covering Year 8 data collection and pretty much statistics. So this is a continuation of the material we learnt in the Year 7 statistics course, and as I said before for other series, we have covered a lot of this stuff in the Year 8 content in the Year 7 videos. So some of these things I'm going to be skipping. If you notice it's missing from this series, just go back to that Year 7 series and you can access that content. But today we are talking about types of data. Now, before we can even start talking about this topic, I've used this word data here, but what does that actually mean? What am I talking about when I mention the word data? So let's take a minute to define this. So data, in the simplest way possible, data is a collection of information. This can be collected from anyone, anywhere, at any time. Now you may be asking yourself, this definition is really broad, right? I'm collecting information. Okay, is that information about, I don't know, favorite color? Is it information about, I don't know, the height of a population? Is it information about the number of cars owned by families? What I've stated here are three very different pieces of information, three very different types of data. So I want to eliminate this really broad definition. It's still important to understand what data is, but in dealing with this, it's important to categorize this type of data, to categorize different types of data. We want to put these all under different umbrellas because that makes it easier for us to actually deal with data and interpret it. It's too broad of a definition. These three pieces of information, they are all very different. They all fall under different categories. So in this video, we're going to talk about placing different bits of data in different categories under these different umbrellas. And in doing that, we're also going to talk at the end about collecting data, the different type of sources of data we get, and then we're going to go into some questions just to revise the ideas we've talked about. Now, there are two main, let's call them categories of data. One of these is called numerical data. Numerical data, the other is categorical. Now, what do these mean? Well, one of these, hopefully in the name, should seem pretty self-explanatory. Numerical data, that is dealing with numerals. It's dealing with numbers. Let's just think, what does that sound familiar to? The number numerical sounds like number. So here we are dealing with an easiest possible definition. We are dealing with numbers. Therefore, for categorical, the data is not numerical. It's any type of data that's not numerical. So data that is not dealing with numbers. So this one, for example, favorite color, notice that this particular bit of data is the only one that doesn't have numbers. The height of a population, that's going to be some kind of numerical thing. The number of cars owned by families, this idea of a number, that is numerical. So I can already, by establishing these definitions, I can already start pigeonholing these three examples I've given. So this favorite color, for example, that would fall under the categorical type of data. We can already start thinking about this stuff. So these are the main two types of data. But if we take a closer look at numerical, there are a couple of subcategories we need to consider, and we're going to talk about those now. But so far, this is the main takeaway I want you guys to have. Numerical data deals with numbers, categorical deals with anything that's not numbers. So, for example, I would be dealing here with, say, I don't know, favorite color. Or, let's say, I don't know, brand of cars. Brand of cars. And as an exercise, have a think about a third type that I could add here. Now, said before, I want to take a closer look at numerical data because this, within it, numbers are quite broad in themselves. So we want to further specify this because you'll see there are some very subtle differences in types of numerical data. So if I shift this here, we're going to break this up into two sections. One of these is called discrete. Discrete numerical data. Now, what do I mean by that? Discrete numerical data is only particular numerical values. So let me write that down and then we'll take a closer look. So only particular numerical values. So something like this would be, for example, number of pets in a household, or even this previous example of number of cars owned by families. This, let's do this in a different color, is our numbers of values. So we're dealing mainly with integers here, with, for example, 0, 1, 2, 3. So if I want to measure, for example, the number of pets in a household, we're going to be dealing with numbers like 0, 1, 2, etc. Right? We are only dealing with whole numbers here. We're not saying, oh yeah, I have 2.5 cats or 2.25 cats. That hopefully is not present in a household. I would be concerned if it was. We're dealing with whole numbers here. So the number of pets in a household, or the number of cars owned. You're not going to have 3.5 cars. You're going to have these whole numbers. So this is what we mean by discrete numerical. This is data that is particular numerical values. So it has to have a whole number attached to it. So number of pets in a household, number of cars owned by a family. Have a think of maybe two more that we could put here. You can do this in your own time. Now, that's numerical data. Oh, sorry, that's discrete numerical data. And the other category is continuous numerical data. What is that? Well, what we mean by this is that the data can take any value in a range of values. So let's write here. I'll write it down first. We'll talk about it in a second. Data that can take any value in a range. A range. Sorry if this is getting a little bit messy. So what do I mean by that? I mean that when we measure certain things and certain types of data we take, these values can fall anywhere along a spectrum, right? So say, for example, we were measuring people's heights. That's an example I used here, the height of a population. When I measure height, think about a ruler. It has a bunch of different values. There is a continuous spectrum of values. So going from, 180 centimeters to 185 centimeters, we have all these continuous little values on a spectrum. Now I've done these a certain bit apart, but I can even go smaller. Sure, I can have 183 centimeters here, but I can also have 181.3. Or if I wanted to get more specific, I could go 182.47 centimeters. So the scale at which we measure this data, we are including a continuous spectrum of values. We are talking about any value, numerical value, because remember, this is still numerical data. We're talking about any numerical value along some kind of range. So if you consider, for example, the height of a population, you're going to have the shortest person in the country, the largest person in the country. And all of the other values, they're not necessarily just a counting number like we have here, 0, 1, 2. They can take on any height along this spectrum of height here. So a couple more examples here. We looked at, the height of a population. We can talk about the weight, for example, of a population. We can talk about the temperature, because all of these three things I've said, we can measure these along some kind of range of values, some kind of spectrum here. And our values, when we collect the data, we're going to have all of these along a range. They're not just going to be, 1, 2, 3, like we have in discrete numerical. So that's how we can define continuous. Now have a go at a couple of maybe 1 or 2 more that you can think of in this continuous numerical data category. So now we have defined these 3 types of data that we're going to be dealing with in this topic. We are dealing with categorical data and we are dealing with numerical data. And once we dig in a bit deeper in numerical data, we're talking about 2 distinct categories here, two distinct types of numerical data, those being discrete and continuous. Cool. So now that we've defined all of these bits of data, and I apologize if this seems a bit dry, it's very important when we deal with data to understand all the different types and how they work. So this video is going to be quite definitional. So now that we've talked about these, let's just consider data collection. How can data be collected? data be collected. So let's think about this. Well, if you were trying to get information about an entire population, what would you do? Well, I would likely get just a massive thing. I'd put out this massive survey. I'd get a big organization. If I'm running the government, I would get an organization to collect first-hand information from people. So I would conduct what's called, at least what we have in Australia, we have something called a census. So the Australian Bureau of Statistics, they put out this thing called a census, and that goes to all these different households. And we're collecting first-hand information from people. Now, this type of data is what we call, this type of data collection, I should say, is what we call a primary source of data. Source. So what this essentially means is first-hand info from the original source. So from the person. So from the person or organization that needs the data, or organization needing the data. So think about these big nationwide surveys we do that the Bureau of Statistics runs. So this is the organization that needs the data. Now, second type is called a secondary source. Now, the data has still been collected, but it has been published or summarized by someone else before we use it. Also, sorry, I should put here examples. For example, here we have census or anything from, for example, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, where the country where I'm from. Now, secondary sources of data, these are ones that have been summarized by someone else before we use it. So it's summarized by someone else before we use it. So we are using it second. That's a good way to remember this. It's a secondary source because we're using it second. Someone has already dealt with this data. So this can be data from, for example, so it's not straight from the source like primary is. This is something like newspaper articles, for example. Whoops. This is something like news articles or an internet blog, for example. So news source, newspaper source, or I don't know, an internet blog or a site. These are secondary sources of data. Now, that's it for all the definitional stuff. Once again, if it was a bit dry, sorry about that, but there's some of these things we really need to drill home and understand before we can even deal with questions. Now that we understand these, let's talk about some examples. So let's get straight into some questions. And here, we want to, for my first question, we want to classify the different forms of data here. We've done a little bit here before, but we're going to classify first say you have a kid, you are going to, there's a couple of things that the hospital is going to collect some information about the baby, just so you can know it as well, and it gets recorded. So one of the things, for example, will be the gender of the baby. And another thing will be, let's say, the length of a baby, the newborn. Let's say here, newborn. So you've just come out of the hospital and they've recorded these different bits of data about your child. So let's think about this. We are looking at example A, the gender of the baby. Now, if we think about this, is whatever this is this going to be a number? Well, no, the gender of something is not a number. So we automatically can rule out numerical data. So what's the only option we have left? That is categorical data. See, not too bad. The first question we want to ask when classifying any data, are there numbers involved? We're talking about gender, there are no numbers involved. We can go straight into ruling out numerical and classifying this as categorical. Now, what about the length of a baby? Well, a length is some type of measurement. What does measurement involve? Measurement involves numbers. Now, it's important here. Let's consider the type of numbers we're dealing with. Think about how you measure length. You measure length on a ruler or a tape measure or whatever. There is an entire spectrum of information here. There are a range of values that make a length. So think about this. Are these individual counting numbers, like for example, the number of pets or the number of cars like we talked about before? No. So we can rule out discrete numerical for this one. So think about this spectrum on a ruler. It is continuous. There are a range of values that fall on this ruler or this tape measure if we were to measure the length of the baby or the height. So the type of data we're dealing with here is continuous numerical data. That's it for classifying variables. Now let's do one more example, and we're going to classify data based on whether we think it was collected from a primary or a secondary source. So, example A, let's see whether a primary or secondary source is suitable for each of these collections of data. So let's look at, for example, the first one, the average income of, I'm from Australia, so let's say Australian households. Okay, now, average income of Australian households. Who do you think would likely be running this type of thing? Well, this is a pretty big piece of information, and we're going to want to collect this straight from the source. So who would likely want to know this? Well, it would probably be something like the Australian government. So to do this, they're going to run some big survey. So this will likely be, well, it will be a primary source of data. And this will be via for example, a census. via a population census. Because here we want to just justify why we've chosen this. Average income of Australian households, this is going to be probably carried out by some kind of government body, some organization. Because this is a pretty important piece of data for the government to know. So another one, let's try to classify this. The favorite washing powder. Of a population. What do we think this one might be? Well, we can consider who's going to carry something like this out. Well, this would likely be, say, maybe not a primary source. Here, we are looking at a secondary source. Oops. Why? Because this could be carried out using, say, results from be a market research agency, something like this, because we can run a primary thing, which we can conduct it ourselves, but we're not going to conduct something for the entire population. This is going to be too big of a thing to run for something, a favorite washing powder, something quite trivial. So something like a smaller agency may run something like this. So from, for example, a phone survey on a smaller part of the population. So this wouldn't be run by the highest level of government, for example, or a survey or this massive nationwide thing that we can carry out. This is going to likely be from a secondary data source. One of these data sources where it will be summarized by someone else, something like a marketing agency. Then we're going to look at this, and then maybe if it's relevant, we can use it. But this is, in essence, an introduction. This video has been an introduction into different types of data and how we can collect it. The main takeaways here, and what's going to help us later on in our schooling, is summarizing this data and categorizing it, putting it into these different types of categories for the thing we're measuring. So data is collection of information, like we said, and the information we get, for example, these three examples, are all different types. We want to categorize these in nice different groups, and we collect this data through primary or secondary sources.